And we're live. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? So in case you're new here, I am the Godless engineer, and I'm sitting down with Trent Horn today. And we're going to be discussing the reliability or the historical nature of the Gospel of Luke. And I'm so thankful that Trent was able to work me into his very busy schedule to talk with me, because I've been watching you on YouTube and in debates for the longest time there, Trent. And like I said, I really appreciate you sitting down to talk with me.
Yeah, and I'm grateful you were able to have me on your channel for this topic. So definitely looking forward to chat about it.
Awesome. So uh, first up, do you want to tell like everybody where they can find you here on YouTube and everything like that?
Oh, yeah, sure. So my name, for those who don't know me, my name is Trent Horn. I'm an apologist and speaker at Catholic Answers, whose website is Catholic.com. We were the first people back in the day to get Catholic.com as a as a domain name. And so I've written books, got a few master's degrees. Right now I'm married and live with my 3 children in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I have a podcast called The Council of Trent. If you're Catholic, you get the pun. Counsel. That's available on iTunes, Google Play, and also on YouTube. And so I usually do a few episodes during the week there on all kinds of subjects.
Okay, awesome. And of course, like I said, if you don't know me, I'm Godless Engineer. You can find me here on YouTube at wherever we're playing this at, and also on any social media as Godless Engineer. All right, so let's go on ahead and dive right in
Sure.
to the topics. We're here to discuss the reliability of the historical nature of the Gospels, and so I'm just kind of curious, what is your take on the reliability and historical nature of the Gospel of Luke?
Yeah. I thought it's interesting to focus on Luke's gospel because I think it's the one that gets singled out by critics and supporters as being the most reliable or the closest to the genre of ancient historiography. So, my position on the gospels in general, but especially on Luke's gospel, is that that it's reasonable to believe that this is a reliable historical document. It's not necessarily a transcript of everything that happened in the life of Jesus, but it gives us the gist of the historical life and ministry of Jesus, as well as the history and unfolding of the church that he founded, which would be in Luke's second volume, Acts. So many scholars will talk about Luke Acts as one work. And it's even been hypothesized that Luke and Acts were one work, and then they were separated as the Gospels were put together. So I would just say, yeah, I'd say that Luke is a careful and good historian, and many other people acknowledge that. I read a 2006 essay by Richard Carrier, actually, who's a very prominent skeptical scholar. And he says this. He criticizes Luke, but he says, this is not to say that Luke, for example, was a lousy historian. He was certainly better than average. So I think if I can hear someone like Richard Carrier saying Luke is better than average, I think that's good. I wouldn't say he's the greatest historian of all time, but I would say he's good, and he gives us a generally reliable picture of Jesus's ministry and the early life of the church.
Okay, all right. Obviously, I do have some issues with that. Um,
Sure.
Most namely, I'm wondering, how do you, in light of that position, I mean, how do you explain the synoptic problem exactly? Like the fact that Luke copies a lot of information from Matthew and Mark.
Sure. What I would say, so for people who are unaware, the synoptic problem is well, it's a problem in the sense that theologians and New Testament scholars are trying to figure out what is the relationship between the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called synoptic. That means one eye, in a sense that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are telling, in many cases, they are describing the same events, but from different perspectives. And so the question is, they seem to be related to one another, though scholars disagree about exactly how they're related to one another. The traditional view, called the Augustinian hypothesis, is that Matthew wrote his, going back to St. Augustine in the 5th century, says that Matthew wrote first, and then Mark derived Matthew as a source, and then Luke derived from Mark and Matthew. Though alternative hypotheses have emerged since then, most scholars today would endorse two views. One would be called Markan priority, the idea that Mark's gospel was written first. It's more rudimentary, kind of more of a basic approach, except for its passion narrative, which is extremely cohesive. A lot of the narrative in Mark seems like, string of pearls, like stories that are told. And then Matthew and Luke would come after Mark. I am undecided. Well, I'm sorry, Markan priority is one view, very popular today. The other view is called the Q hypothesis, that you have Mark and then a collection of Jesus's sayings that are a unique source, either as a written document or unwritten. It's called Q, which is for the German word Quelle. A lot of biblical scholars subscribe that Mark and Q are kind of first. Matthew and Luke have a different relationship with them. Mark Goodacre is a scholar, though, who questions Q, and I'm kind of agnostic about whether Q exists myself. So now, personally, when it comes to Luke being historian, what does that mean? Because let me see if I can get my math right here. About 41% of Luke's gospel seems to be word for word or a very close paraphrase of Mark's gospel. Another 25% of it is shared with Matthew, but is not found in Mark. Either it's from Matthew, if Luke came after Matthew, or maybe they share a common source, or Matthew borrowed this from Luke. And then finally, about a third of Luke's gospel is unique to Luke. That would be called the L source. It's not found in either Mark or Matthew. These are things like the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son, the story of Jesus' appearance on the road to Emmaus. And so some people might say, well, if Luke is such a good historian, why is he just copying from Mark? Well, I would say there's good evidence that Mark is very close to the events he describes, and that he used Peter as a source because Peter features prominently in Mark's gospel. And the early 2nd century church father Papias of Hierapolis notes a common belief that Mark wrote down Peter's sermons, but not necessarily in chronological order. And so Luke and in the preface of Luke's gospel, he talks about how others had set forth orderly accounts of the things that had happened in Jesus's life, and he was going to do the same. So this seemed like a good source for him to use. Now, in the ancient world, nobody cared about plagiarism. There's no copyright laws. There's no DMCA takedown notices. Copying was totally fine to do. And this also comes up when you have Matthew. Like, if Matthew was an apostle, he could have been the apostle Matthew or a disciple of the apostle Matthew. Why would he copy Mark? One of my views on this is that I was reading a book recently by Randolph Richards called Paul in First Century Letter Writing. And basically, when you wrote something in the ancient world, it was super expensive to hire secretaries, papyrus, ink. So the letter to the Romans, 16 chapters long, would have cost, and I apologize for rambling, I'm almost there. The letter to the Romans would have cost Paul about $2,000 to create. So since Mark's gospel is about the same length as Romans, that amount of text, $2,000 to put together. It's not like when you and I write something, we've got a word processor. It's easy to go through drafts and, fix things. Luke is probably someone thinking, wow, this is all really good. I'm going to use that and save my money on papyrus and things like that. And he also considers it a reliable source. But once again, by the way, I don't want to ramble too much in this. If you need to interject or anything, feel free to do so.
I'm very much allowing people to finish when they're talking, and
that's nice. That's so nice to hear.
Yeah, I hate being interrupted as well. Generally,
sure.
the only times that I interrupt people is when they seem to be, I guess, droning on, like repeating the same things over and over. But I didn't hear that from you, obviously. Sure. But this leads into an interesting discussion on the sources and methodology of Luke, which differs greatly from ancient historians of the time. Because what we have in Luke is a very obvious lack of sourcing. Like you said that he probably got his information from Peter just because he's predominantly like featured in Luke's gospel, but that's not
Mark.
Huh?
If the part where Luke is using Mark, that would make
Oh.
sense if Mark was using Peter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, still, so I didn't mean to get that wrong.
No,
Uh,
you're fine.
but this is you'd acknowledge that this is widely different from how historians record history, right?
Are you talking about ancient historians or ancient
Yes,
biographers?
yes,
Uh,
ancient historians and biographers.
you mean about like mentioning the particular sources one uses?
Yes, because in ancient biographies, ancient historians that are recording history, they extensively discuss what sources they are using. They name them, and they, as far as methodology goes, they
Hmm.
discuss the methodology that they use in order to reconcile different traditions or different information coming from different sources, and we just simply don't find that in Luke at all. So I'm kind of curious what you think about that.
Sure. So I have a few thoughts on that. My primary thought would be that when you try to find the genre of the Gospels, it's difficult because they're not exact parallels to anything that we find in the ancient world. But what I would say, so for Luke, I don't believe that Luke was an ancient historian like Thucydides or Herodotus, but I think he was really interested in that. I consider Luke to be a doctor who was really, really interested in history. And so that would go back to the identification of the gospel being authored by the physician Luke that's noted in the letter to the Colossians. And I think there's good evidence for that. A few lines that lead me down this path. One would be that a New Testament scholar, Loveday Alexander, compared Luke's preface. So, for those who are following along at home, the preface is the first 4 verses of Luke's gospel. And well, I'll just read them. Do you care if I just read them and then we can continue so people know what we're
Uh,
talking about?
yeah, that's fine.
Sure. So, this is what Luke writes at the beginning of his gospel. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed. So this is an interesting preface. First, Luke's work, what he's writing here, it appears to be to an individual. Some have claimed that Luke is writing to every Christian and everybody is Theophilus. Theophilus is a Greek word that means God lover or loved by God. But also, Theophilus was a common name in the ancient world. And I see no reason to think that he's writing. It's more probable to me he's writing to a person because he adds in front of it the Greek word optime, most excellent, which is an adjective reserved more for like people in leadership positions. This could have been a wealthy patron, maybe a wealthy Roman official. I also think Theophilus could be Theophilus ben Ananus, who was the high priest of the Sadducees in the 40s, because Luke's gospel is very focused on wealth and the temple and the Sadducees. But that's. So the point is, Luke's written this preface. It does seem, I know Richard Carrier in that same essay, he says, Luke's preface consciously mimics those of known histories and is an important marker of that genre. So it's interesting. Carrier even says it consciously mimics, and I kind of agree because I feel like Luke was a doctor doing his best to do history, and he was very focused on that. So this New Testament scholar, Loveday Alexander, compared Luke's preface to ancient technical manuals, like the same opening preface you would find in a medical manual, like Galen's Physicians, things like that. And she says it's more like that than the preface of ancient histories. So I think Luke cares a lot about getting things right, being exact. Now, your concern is, well, most ancient historians think of like Thucydides, even Arian, like in the Anabaptist of Alexander, he says, I quoted Polybius, I've cited this person, and Luke doesn't do that. And I would say that's true, but many historians and biographers of the time also don't do that. I'll give you a few examples. Plutarch in his Roman Lives, he rarely cites sources. Christopher Pelling talks about that in his 1979 article on it. Um, in the Blackwell Companion to the Punic Wars. So the Punic Wars were these wars that were fought between Rome and Carthage about 200, 300 years before Christ was born. And in there, in the companion, it says that Polybius, who Arian cites about Alexander, mentions some Greek sources, but most are left unnamed. And Richard Carrier also notes this, saying that he says lesser historians like Plutarch and Suetonius occasionally mention their sources. So I agree with you. Like people who are like trying to make their name, like I'm a big fancy historian, they do that more. But it wasn't uncommon in the ancient world to simply have sources, not cite them, and just try to tell the story as best you could. So for me, I don't find it problematic that Luke does not identify his sources. I think we've got good clues as to who or what they were.
Well, see, and I have a problem with the clues that's often mentioned for whose source Luke's is, because it just seems like a whole lot of speculation to me. And I get that not every historian listed every single source, but
Hmm.
the fact is that the trend among ancient historians was to cite by name at least some of your sources for the information that you got. Like, we could bring up Arian's biography on Alexander the Great. I
Right.
mean, he mentions how he has firsthand sources from two of Alexander's generals. He names them and everything,
Well, I'm
and we just don't find this from Luke's gospel. And
sure.
unless you have something of that nature in the gospel, I really don't think that speculating about his sources really helps at all.
Well, I have two thoughts on that. First, it's interesting on the Anabasis of Alexander, one of our important sources on the life of the Macedonian conqueror Alexander the Great. The Anabasis was written about 400 years after Alexander lived. And you're right, he cites two individuals he finds helpful, Polybius and Aristobulus. Though interesting, Polybius, the Blackwell companion of the Punic Wars, says that Polybius himself didn't cite many of his Greek sources, which is interesting. Now, I disagree with your contention about the histories. Like, if you read especially the biographies of Plutarch, the other biographical works, even many of the histories, they just jump right into the story without the sources. But I do have a question for you about, so like the Anabasis, Arian's writing about 400 years later. He cites Polybius and Aristobulus as his sources. Like, imagine if I was sharing with you and I said, "Hey, I believe in this guy Jesus, and the source I have for him is written by Saint Augustine in the 5th century, so 400 years later." And Augustine tells us he wrote from Mark and John, and Mark was with Peter. Like it just seems to me like if that were the evidence I had for Jesus, you would just consider that totally, because we wouldn't have Mark and John in that example, just like we don't have Polybius and Aristobulus's works at Arian sites. It seems
Mhm.
like if that was the Christian view, right? It's Augustine writing 400 years later. He cites two sources, but we don't have them anymore. I don't think people would take that really seriously because it's in a Christian context. You see where I'm coming from here?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot more problems with that particular scenario in the first place. Like, for instance, as far as we know from Paul's work, there were no disciples. There was nobody that was specifically cited as knowing Jesus while he was alive. Which
Well,
that's a different discussion. I know. Uh,
yes, maybe one day we'll discuss that because
yeah.
I guess you make, well, while he was alive in Galatians 1, he does speak to other apostles, Peter and James.
Yes, but apostle does not mean disciple or
Sure.
somebody that
Uh,
knew Jesus while he was
Well,
walking on earth.
well, an apostle is just someone who is sent. So Paul knew people that Jesus sent, I guess.
Well, yes, but I mean, in the context of Paul, with him comparing himself to the other apostles and saying that he was just like the other apostles, I mean, it kind of seems to me that he's indicating that no apostles saw Jesus while he was alive. They were only visited by Jesus after he resurrected as a celestial version of himself, is what it
And we
seems to
and,
me.
and now we got to the mythicist debate. It only took 14 minutes. Well,
Well,
but that's where but it's interesting though with
was there anything wrong with what I said, though?
about the nature of the apostles and whether they actually knew Jesus.
Well, no, about the nature of how Jesus appeared to the apostles.
Appeared in what context?
Well, the only context that we know of, and that's through Paul and what he says about being an apostle and what the apostles experienced.
Well, Paul talks about his conversion related to Jesus, and then Luke records his version of the conversion experiences in the Acts of the Apostles, and he recounts Paul sharing it three separate times in Acts. And to shift our discussion back to Luke
Luke,
and his
yeah.
reliability, I would say there that it's interesting is that Luke shares stories about Paul. He seems to have an intimate knowledge of Paul's journeys, in some cases in the first person. There are passages where he describes, he inserts himself into the narrative. I know you don't agree with that, but we'll probably get to that. Where he has an intimate knowledge of Paul that isn't derived solely from the epistles. For example, Luke describes Paul, when Jesus appears to Paul in Acts, he calls Paul by his Hebrew name, Saul, whereas in Paul's epistles, he always uses his Roman name, Paul, because he was the apostle to the Gentiles, which I would say shows a distinction there in his sources of just not just relying only on the epistles. But and then I think, yeah, Luke has, so he's close to Paul in that regard, and there about 12% of the Acts of the Apostles are written in the first person plural, which seem to describe which I believe can be plausibly taken to be that Luke was accompanying Paul on many of his voyages and also on the land trips connected to these voyages.
Yeah, but scholars like Michael Purvo and others have shown that there's a pretty good connection between those particular passages and works like the Odyssey. And so these we passages aren't indicative that Luke was with Paul or anything of that nature, just that he was pulling from the Odyssey and these other sources. Because I date Luke's gospel and Luke and Acts to at least after 93 CE,
Wow,
because
that's late even for more liberal biblical scholars. A lot of them tap out at the 80s.
I don't know why, because I mean, it's been fairly conclusively proven that Luke's gospel uses a lot of Josephus's work in order to add a bunch of historical background information to his work. And since that information wasn't written by Josephus until 93 CE, it seems like it makes sense to me that Luke would have written after that point.
Yeah, and I would disagree with the claim that it has been proven that Luke was using Josephus. I know this
Mhm.
is a hypothesis that has been proposed by Steve Mason in his book, Josephus and the New Testament, showing that at the very least, Josephus and Luke talk about similar events. They talk about the rebellions of Theudas and the Egyptian. So they do cover similar events. I'm not convinced that proposal. Well, I guess 2 points here. One, I would say that this is a minority view. It's not one that is anywhere near a majority view in New Testament scholarship. In Mason's book, Josephus and the New Testament, this is what he says about the hypothesis Luke used Josephus or Josephus used Luke. He says on page 251, neither position has much of a following today because of the significant differences between the two works and their accounts of the same events. So I would say that the subject matter is similar in many cases, but like you can tell when Luke is using Mark because he just like directly quotes or very closely paraphrases, but you don't find similar things when you compare Acts 5 and 21 with Jewish Wars 2 or Antiquities 20. So I disagree that it's the majority view or that it needs to place Luke that far in the first century. I would place the authorship of Luke more in the 60s, and I have my own reasons for that. So
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm fairly convinced by the case for placing Luke after 93 CE. But going back to your original proposal there of Augustine using Mark and Luke in order to write his stuff in comparison to Arian, I feel like there's a lot more that there are a lot more problems with stating that like Mark and this Luke character um uh wrote anything down. I think that that's where my problem with a lot would lie with that. Whereas with Arian and his sources, these were like official records. We also have other physical items that attest to these two generals existing. So I mean, there's a lot more evidence for the sources that Arian used than there is for like if Augustine used Mark and Luke. Now,
but we don't have them though. We don't have the. Otherwise, we'd be using those instead of Arian.
well, true, that's true, but I mean, I'm not of the. I don't think that you necessarily need to have like the first-hand accounts. You can definitely get them through a secondary means, like through Arian. I think like if we would have some kind of independent evidence of anybody that contemporaneously wrote about Jesus other than Paul, and they were citing that information, reliably citing that information, I would be perfectly fine with that situation. But the problem is that we don't have any of that. Like most, if not all, of the writings after the Gospels were starting to be written are based on the gospel accounts or on Paul's accounts. So, like, we don't have anything that's independent from Paul or the gospels.
So you're saying, well, we don't have any first century written sources beyond the letters of Paul, beyond the New Testament letters and the Gospels.
Right. And the gospels are ultimately all based off of Paul's work and other oral traditions that we obviously don't have access to now, but I mean, it ultimately resolves down into, Paul's version of Jesus.
Well, I think that's a bit of a stretch, because if we go back to Luke and what his sources are, about 40% of it comes from Mark.
Mm-hmm.
And your hypothesis there would have to be that all of Mark's accounts are from Paul, even though Paul does not give a that. Essentially, Mark would have to be creating all of these healing stories and miracle stories that are not in Mark out of whole cloth for some reason, instead of just trying to write ancient biography. And then we also have special Luke, the L source, which is a third of Luke that is not in Mark and is not in Matthew, as if
Mm-hmm.
Luke was either he made that up or he got that from different traditions or written sources that we don't have now. So I think that it's a bit of an overreach to say, well, it all ultimately is Paul, because Paul does not have all of this stuff within his epistles.
Well, I mean, I said that it ultimately resolves to Paul. I just mean as like a first century like written source that we have. It all dates back to Paul, but Paul mentions, I believe is it Galatians 1:11 maybe. I believe he mentions how he gets his information from visions that he gets from Jesus, but also scriptures. And then we also have Philo of Alexandria and Josephus that both relay information that says that the Jews in the first century, right around the time that Paul was writing, were searching the scriptures for information about the Messiah of the Jews. And so what my full idea here is as far as in the context of Luke goes, is that Luke copied directly from both Mark and Matthew. Mark got a lot of the Christian tenets and basic theological stuff from Paul, but also Mark cites a lot of scripture stuff. Luke also cites a lot of scripture stuff. So ultimately,
Well,
as far as the
where
sources
does
go,
sure go ahead.
as far as like the sources go for Luke, what it seems to me is that Luke used the other gospels that were written, which also include Paul's work, but also he uses the scriptures in order to generate a lot of the story, like the miracles. Those are deeply coupled to the miracles that are found in the Old Testament.
hmm Right, but they're also distinct from the miracles in the Old Testament. I know this gets us away from Luke, but John talks about Jesus performing a miracle that had never been done before, which would be healing someone who had been blind from birth, for example. Or when Jesus performs miracles, he does them on his own authority without having to plea for God or invoke God to do it on God's own authority. But when it comes to Luke's sources, though, I don't think that it's problematic in what he derives from. He seems to be very sober in putting them together. And ultimately, though, I think for you and I, when it comes to figuring out, all right, was Luke a reliable historian? Does he reliably give us what he recorded? You and I would have to figure out, okay, well, what is our test to figure out whether something is reliable or not? And I would say Luke is, even if he's writing in the year 90, which I think is too late, I would put it in the 60s. He's still very close compared to when other ancient historians write about things. And also, so Luke is in. Let me put 3 points here to consider. First, we have good evidence of who Luke is and that Luke wrote this gospel. And I don't think that it's anonymous. I think there's good evidence that it was written by him, that he was in a position to know these things and acquire these sources. And number three, when we put Luke to the test, when he describes the events in Jesus's life and things that are happening, he shows himself to be a very competent historian because he consistently gets things right. He gets local names and titles right. That would be very difficult for someone removed even by a few decades to get. Herod and Agrippa's correct titles, that Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia. We didn't know that until we got an inscription a few years ago. One interesting one in Luke's corpus that I find compelling. In Acts chapter 18, Luke records Paul meeting Priscilla and Aquila, and Luke mentions offhand, they were there because Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome. Now, what's
Mhm.
interesting is that Josephus and Tacitus did not record this event, but Suetonius did. And so Luke managed to get something right that even two major historians of the time did not get. So I would say with those 3 points, there's a presumption that Luke is reliably transmitting this story about Jesus, carefully gathering sources together. And I don't see a good reason to think that he got the main gist of the story wrong about who Jesus was and that, he's a traveling miracle worker. And then he died, rose again, and sent forth apostles to communicate that message.
Well, so I don't see how, because you have to understand how that comes across to me as
Mhm.
like a trying to think of the correct term here. It's like a composite fallacy. Maybe is the correct one, because it
Mhm.
seems like you're taking a small portion of Luke's account and saying because he gets these few things right in history, that means that he's reliable, like on the whole, like he's a reliable enough. But I mean, even Bart Ehrman agrees that the greatest problem of the Gospels is the fulfillment of Scripture from the Old Testament. The fact that they're
Well,
using the Old Testament in
how,
order to
how often?
fulfill.
Sure, sure. How often does Luke do that, though?
I mean, I haven't gone through Luke's extensively to look at it, but I mean, like the miracles that Jesus does is in fulfillment of Scripture. I mean, the entire Passion is in fulfillment of Scripture. The birthplaces supposedly in Luke's is in fulfillment of
But
Scripture.
let's stop right there. Luke never says, for example, that Jesus was born in Bethlehem because of a prophecy. That's in Matthew's gospel. Luke never records that because it's what Scripture says. I would say when Luke does cite Scripture, it's just to show, hey, this is in accord with something, but it's not his source. The only two examples I can think of in Luke would be when Mary and Jesus go to the temple for the dedication. Luke says, well, this is in accord with the Jewish law and this scripture. So he's saying this is why they did it, because the Jewish scriptures say to go do this. To explain
Right.
to his Gentile audience, here's why they would do that, which Josephus does that too. And then when he talks about John the Baptist, he says, John was preaching in the wilderness, and he cites Isaiah 40 as a prophecy being fulfilled. But I wouldn't say that Luke just invented John the Baptist from that prophecy. We know from Josephus that John the Baptist had a ministry, and Luke gets it right about his run-ins with Herod over that.
Well, so the connections between Luke's gospel and the Old Testament is more or less found in the phrases and words used and how it's portrayed, because Luke's gospel does change information that's contained in Matthew's gospel. Like Matthew's gospel, the birth narrative there is a mirroring of Moses' story, and Matthew's gospel has obviously a lot more citations of scripture, but considering that Luke's gospel copies Matthew's gospel, but also copies Mark's gospel.
Well, that's an assumption. Not everyone holds to that view. Some people hold, so there's the view it's Mark, then Luke, then Matthew. Some people would hold it's Mark, Matthew, and then Luke. So that's not a universal position.
Well, I mean, I didn't. I guess I was just speaking of my own personal position. I wasn't speaking necessarily of what everybody thinks, but I mean, the connections are quite clear that Luke copies from Matthew, and then Matthew copies from Mark. At least in my view, it's pretty plainly put there, considering both of those sources only ever cite scriptures as the information that they have. It seems reasonable to me to think that is where Luke is getting his information from, considering the fact that we don't have any direct citations of any other source.
Well, if Luke was copying Matthew, why did he leave out so much of the birth narrative?
I mean, he was writing the tradition of the community of Christians that he was in. I mean, he was writing his own story. He was changing some aspects of Matthew and of Mark, and as the progression goes in the Gospels, Jesus always gets like a little bit more powerful as you get closer to John, and so I mean, you just. You have the instance in Luke where he's changing information, he's adding, he's correcting, and he leaves out things that he doesn't think is important to the story.
Well, that's true. Luke doesn't cover everything, and it depends on what order he's writing in. It could be that Luke is drawing from Matthew, or Matthew drew from Luke, or they draw from a shared tradition. And I agree with you that the synoptic authors are going to be they're going to avoid info dumps. If one evangelist covered something in detail, they might want to complement it or provide another element to it. But that doesn't mean that they've gotten things wrong, or they would invent things from whole cloth. In Luke 1:4, in his preface, he says that his goal in writing this is so that his patron, the person he's giving this information to, may know the truth concerning the things of which you've been informed. So he's received this from a variety of sources. And the hypothesis you're proposing is that he kind of changes it willy-nilly. I mean, I agree with you that in minor details, like the exact words somebody used, ancient historians will paraphrase what somebody said. But I don't know if I can draw that to major changes in the narrative, which also there would be an oral tradition to provide kind of a check on that.
Well, I mean, let's just take the birth narratives of both Matthew and Luke. I mean, that's a vast difference right there. Luke records a completely different birth narrative.
Well, it's not completely different. They do have
they're 10 years apart.
Well, that depends on what you think they're talking about. For example, I would say that Matthew 1 records the Annunciation narrative when Mary becomes pregnant, but Matthew 2 never records Jesus being born. It doesn't have a narrative. Here is what happened. Here are the events transpiring around his birth and what happened there. It just says in the days of Herod the king when Jesus was born. It's talking about a more approximate time scale. And so I think that both accounts are harmonious if we look at Matthew 2 and see that it's talking about when Jesus was older, about maybe around the age of 2, when the Magi come to Jerusalem. They go to Herod because they were looking at the stars, doing their astrology stuff. They go to Herod because he's the current Jewish king, trying to find the new Jewish king. And then they go, and Mary and Joseph were either temporarily residing in Bethlehem from Nazareth because they made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem each year, which the Gospels tell us, or they might have been permanently residing there before they went back to Nazareth. That makes sense to me because it would explain the slaughter of the innocents that Matthew records, that Herod's command is for anyone under the age of 2. Whereas if he was out to kill a newborn Jesus, you wouldn't need to kill 2-year-olds, for example. So let me put a bow on that. That I do believe the birth narratives, while they are different, they are not outright contradictions. But number two, even if they were historically inaccurate or they were not historical elements, you could still hold the view that Luke is reliable as a whole. That'd be like the view Raymond Brown holds in The Birth of the Messiah. He's more of a moderate scholar on these issues.
Well, so I really don't think that you can reconcile it like that, because Luke, his in his birth narrative, Jesus has to be born after 6 A.D. or CE, and then in Matthew's gospel,
Mhm.
he has to be born before 4 BCE.
Well, you're dating that based on, in the Gospel of Luke, it's talking about the census.
Hmm.
Now there was a census that took place in Judea in 6 AD under when Quirinius was governor at the time.
Hmm.
But I don't believe that that's what Luke is talking about in the particular what's what I'm looking for here. Um, the Greek that is used there, there's discussion about what the word prote or protos, it can mean first, but when it's combined with the genitive case as it is in John 1:15, what it's saying is it has the meaning of before. So Luke is saying that there was some kind of registration that took place before the census of Quirinius, that this took place before it, not during it. So I think that that can be reconciled there. But I will say this, that look, if our question is whether Luke is a reliable historian, then I think we should compare him to other historians at the time who make similar errors. Josephus makes similar errors about the siege at Masada, that archaeology has shown that he was incorrect. Polybius, who is one of the sources Arian used for Alexander the Great. Um, I'm sorry. Well, Arian himself makes errors in the Anabasis of Alexander. He gets the sacrifice that Alexander was at wrong. He gets the exact wrong city of where it's supposed to be. So to be a reliable historian, I think it's correct. But even to be a reliable historian, you don't have to be 100% on the mark. I would say Luke has a track record at least as good as other historians of his time.
I mean, I have to disagree with that, because there's a lot of things that Luke does that's counter or antithetical rather to other historians at the time of the same caliber. Like, for instance, there's little to no authorial presence in the narrative whatsoever. Like, other than the preface to the Gospel of Luke, Luke, the author, I'm not going to say Luke, the author of Luke, Luke Acts, doesn't take an active role whatsoever in his narrative. But if you look at somebody like Tacitus and his histories, he takes a very active role, and you'll notice in other historians at the time, they take active roles in their histories, and that's pretty antithetical to it.
Well, I guess
Other historians.
I guess my concern about that, and then I have a question though that I think is important for our discussion about setting up just particular kinds of standards. My thought on that is that this seems to be like a double standard to me, because when you look in Acts and see the presence of first person narration of Luke joining Paul on his different voyages, that's taken as evidence that it's a work of fiction. So it's like if Luke writes in the third person, it's not like real history, but if he writes in the first person in those cases, that's also a case of fiction. To me, it's kind of like a heads I win, tails you lose scenario. Um, but so that's my thought there. But I guess let's zoom out a little. Would you agree then, for to be a reliable historian, you would need these points to say if somebody's a reliable historian, they at least we could reasonably believe they have access to know about the things they describe, and when they do describe things, they generally get things right. But those would be probably two two big tenets to say, yeah, that guy's a good historian or a reliable one.
Um, I mean, as far as like getting things right, I feel like depending on that particular definition, I I think maybe, but see the problem that I have is that
Mhm.
in order for him to be considered a reliable historian, I feel like we would need to compare him to other historical writings at the time.
Sure.
And when we do that, we notice a lot of things that Luke does that's antithetical to historians writing at the time.
Yeah, I've read some people who have made this argument. I think Matthew Ferguson is one of them. And that I think you and I are making the same argument. We're just going to put different standards about what all of the reliable historians of the time have in common. My
Hmm.
criticism of Ferguson's arguments, I read in an essay of his covering this, is that he'll make kind of these sweeping claims about reliable historians that don't apply universally, which I've already shown. For example, naming one's sources, that's not very common in ancient Greek biography. That's even something Carrier admits about Xenophon and Suetonius. So Ferguson puts like 10 criteria for what makes somebody reliable, but they don't apply universally. So I'm just trying to put um, narrow, like two criteria that apply across the board, which is they are close in proximity to what they have access. Like, yeah, they could have learned this stuff. And when they do things and we can check it, hey, it turns up right most of the time. They might make mistakes. All the historians make mistakes, but they're pretty consistent. So I think those two, you could apply that to everybody. Whereas the things you've shared or the things in Ferguson's essay, they aren't universal in that respect. That'd be the concern that I have.
Well, I don't think that Ferguson, and I think I've read the same article that you did from the Infidels site. I don't know if that's
Oh, yeah, he's a classicist, and he published this a few years ago, I think, on the secular web. Yeah.
yeah. So I didn't really see him making those kind of wide sweeping generalizations. I saw him give examples of how, with each section he would give an example of a historian writing at the same time that Luke would have been generally writing in, and how they were a good example of how historians generally wrote. Maybe not like I don't think that he, at least I didn't get from his thing saying that they were always perfect. In fact, I do believe that at the
Oh, no,
very end of it.
yeah, he says at the end that they make a lot of mistakes. My point was when he says, well, to what makes the non-biblical historians and writers and biographers different is they have things like authorial presence. They are doing biography, not hagiography. They're writing about a person with their flaws. They're not glorifying him. But my
Mhm.
concern with Ferguson is that, yeah, he'll then give an example of Thucydides naming his sources. But I've just given you several examples of ancient writers who don't name their sources. And so that shows that there's a wide counterexample there.
Well,
Or
I
with
mean, I'm sorry. Go
Go ahead.
ahead.
Yeah, right. So for me, no, there's lots of other ones we consider reliable that don't conform to that practice, who would write like Luke writes, or Arian and the Anabasis of Alexander. That example, I would say, if you read A.B. Bosworth's 1976 article, Errors in Arian, published in the Classical Quarterly, he talks about how Arian is basically, he's got a serious man crush on Alexander. He's basically doing hagiography and he gets things wrong in the process because he feels other people didn't adequately represent who Alexander was. But I still think Arian gives us a lot of reliable information in spite of difficulties we may find. And if people have that mindset, I think they can apply that to Luke, even if they don't consider Luke to be scripture or things like that.
Well, I don't know. I think classifying Aryan as doing a hagiography is a little far-reaching.
I
Uh,
just read the Bosworth article. I think it's pretty compelling, but
okay, I'll check. I'll check it out. I also I'm not sure about the Theodicies. Not citing any sources.
no,
But
he definitely did. He definitely did. I was mentioning people like Plutarch or Xenophon or
okay.
Suetonius. Josephus also So people like Thucydides, yeah, they relish in that. That's why we call him the father of history. He's nowhere near as fun to read in Greek as Herodotus, though. Herodotus has way more fun stories that aren't always reliable. But Josephus does the same thing. And Josephus puts us closer to the context of where Luke was writing. Like Josephus, for example, records the siege at Masada, which was a fortress that the Jews occupied during the Jewish War, and he claims nearly 1,000 of them committed suicide rather than being captured by the Romans. And so Josephus gives this narrative. He doesn't give us a source to this. The source is basically him, and archaeology has shown many of the things he describes about it that's not actually how it happened. But we still consider Josephus reliable enough to give us a sense of what happened in the Jewish wars. And so, like I said, if we give this leeway to the other authors, I say Luke has proven himself time and time again. If you read Colin Hemer's work, the Book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history, it's amazing the intricate things Luke gets right over and over again.
Well, I mean, you could. I feel like the criteria that you've set out, though, you could easily apply this to, comic book characters now, especially in the Marvel universe. A lot of people bring up Spider-Man,
Sure.
but I mean, just in these various fantastical universes, you have real places, real events, real people. And I feel like the criteria that you've set up would not be able to adequately distinguish fantasy from fact.
Well, how do we distinguish the genre of comic book from the genre of, let's say, ancient biography or ancient history? One difference I would say is that reading Luke's preface, it seems clear he is saying, and even Carrier agrees that he's mimicking at least historians, that he is attempting to do history. Like he makes his purpose very clear at the beginning. Whereas with comic books, there are different tropes and things we can identify to show it's a work of fiction. So, for example, comic books will describe things that are absolute, complete fabrications. Talking about how a large city was destroyed one week, even though you and I can go and visit there. But we don't see those same kinds of errors in Luke, and so he would conform to other historians.
Well, I mean, in Luke, I mean, he gets basic geography wrong. That's one of the indications that we get that he's pulling information from Josephus, because Josephus got some geographical locations wrong in exactly the same order. That's one of the ways I can remember right off the top of my head that they connect Josephus and Luke, the Gospel of Luke. But going back to the introduction, I mean, even in the new Oxford Annotated Bible,
Sure.
it talks about how Luke plainly lays out that he's only doing this to reinforce Christian faith, and while he's mimicking what historians do at the time, his intro is very different than what comparable historians actually do, and that's discuss sources, discuss methods.
Well, I would say that some historians do that, but I've already shown there are many who don't. And also, I think we have to keep in mind that at this time period, everyone has a particular bias and passion about what they're writing about. Arian has that when it comes to Alexander. Josephus's purpose in writing the Antiquities and his own autobiography in the Jewish War, he's defending the superiority of the Jewish people to the Gentiles in his histories, blatantly so. In one case, Josephus says that the patriarch Abraham gave geometry and math and science to the Egyptians, and that's how the Greeks got it, which is obviously false. And there's other things he says about the Old Testament that didn't possibly happen. So he's clearly writing the Antiquities as a way to try to vindicate Jewish traditions that have lived on to his day. But we can still say, hey, he reliably gets it right. So I would say we should apply the same standards to Luke. Is he close to be able to record these things? And then when it comes to the presence of errors, you brought up the comic book example. You're right. There's either he records something and it did happen. Hooray, you get a point. And he records something and no, that did not happen at all. That really takes a hit. We get way, way, way more of the former than the latter. So I guess, like, for you, like, isn't that seems like a similar standard we use for the biographies of Suetonius or Josephus, even though they don't have a presence in the narrative, they don't discuss their sources. We just kind of have to corroborate them the best we can, you know?
Well, as far as Luke's gospel goes, I don't really see him getting more things right than he does wrong, or reporting, things that happen more so than didn't happen. I see Luke getting a lot of minor things right, like names, places, and things like that. I see that happening, but I don't see him getting actual events right in history. At least nothing that we can corroborate.
Well, he gets the expulsion of the Jews, which not even Tacitus or Josephus got. That's pretty impressive.
Well, I mean, true that he got that part in Acts, but I mean,
Right.
In my view
Mhm.
of things, and a good number of scholars' views, Luke dates pretty late, and so Luke would have had access to the information regardless of whether or not Tacitus or Josephus wrote about it. I think that he would have had access to that information because I mean, I don't think that Luke had direct access to knowledge of what occurred in Jesus's
So,
life
okay.
or
So,
anybody that knew Jesus.
so I guess then so those are two separate questions: the corroboration question and then the access question. Um, on the corroboration question, so have you done like a study to compare like Josephus and Luke and Plutarch and Suetonius to see if Luke's like you said like he gets it more wrong than not. Like, is he less reliable than these other historians? Like, have you done like is you or someone else has done like an analysis of that?
Well, no. What I'm referring to here is the fact that from what we can tell directly, the
Mhm.
sources that Luke used was Scripture, the other Gospels, and Paul, and none of those sources, cite any kind of historical sourcing for their information. And so it seems to me like the things that he
Well,
definitely gets right are names of people, names of places like Pontius Pilate, Herod, Jerusalem, that those kinds of things he gets right. But like the events of Jesus's life seem to be derived from previous gospels as well as the scriptures.
mhm. But he also records different events that are not in Paul or the other letters. So for example, and he doesn't seem to have a direct dependence on them. For example, Luke talks about the split that occurred between him and Barnabas. Though the reason that he gives for the split in the book of Acts is different than the one that Paul gives in Galatians. So he's not merely just mimicking Paul in this. He has access to different sources and witnesses. But I think we're sort of we're going around a little bit here. Like my main thesis, what I've tried to articulate is that we should have, when we use a standard to determine whether a work is reliable, it should be as uniform a standard and applied as broadly as we can. So going on so I think we've seen that with the corroboration question. I think Luke, anyone can look up reliability of Luke and you'll see lots and lots of things corroborate, and not just names and places, but even titles that are hard to come by, or particular events, knowledge of local weather conditions, shipping routes. But you're saying, well, if he was reading Josephus, he can get all that. I believe there's strong evidence that Luke was writing in the 60s because Luke Acts does not record the fall of Jerusalem. If Luke was trying to show that Jesus is super awesome, he would have bluntly said that Jesus's prophecy about the temple being destroyed was fulfilled in Acts. He records the martyrdom of James in Acts 12, but not of Peter and Paul. So I think that there's good evidence that Luke Acts is actually in the early 60s, placing it close to the events and increasing their reliability.
Well, I think that that just seems to be an indication that Luke didn't write about them, not necessarily that he had to write prior to a particular point.
Mhm.
I think that he just he just chose not to write about like the death of Paul, or the any of the other things that you mentioned there. I think that he used his own authorial license
D-
in what he was writing in order to tell the story that he
Sure.
wanted to
Was
tell.
there a certain reason he chose to not write about these very important events, or he just didn't, and we don't know the reason?
I mean, I think that it's very hard to know things for sure in history in general, but I mean, if he was looking to write from a particular point of view,
Mhm.
then and he wanted to place his narrative at a certain point in history, then I think that he would have very good reason to not write about some things and not record some things in history, depending on the point of view that he was going for and the point in time.
Like he was pretending to be writing in the 60s, even though he wrote in the 90s?
Yeah, well, I mean, in order for in order for him to be, writing about Paul and everything like that, I think that he would kind of have to be writing from that point of view, and aiming to write about that period of time.
Yeah, and I would just say that when I read it, it seems straightforward. Luke is not pretending to be in a 60s context from the future and refraining from talking about future events that haven't happened yet. He just is writing in that context. And the conscious reason that he chooses to not write about the fate of very important things for him in his narratives, the temple, Paul, and Peter, is those events had not transpired yet. But yeah. Well, I think we can go for another few minutes. I don't want my wife to yell at me because I have to
Yeah, I know.
take
I
which
was I was I was gonna try to start wrapping things up
okay, well
here.
here, why don't we it's your show. Wrap up how you like, and then do as you will. They'll be fine. We'll figure it out.
Okay. All right.
This has been
Well,
fun. Sorry, it was good. I appreciate at least like, when it comes to understanding historical framework, I think what's important is for people to go read the sources and then read a variety of scholars of different viewpoints and see what you find um, helpful in that regard. So you could read more conservative scholarship like Craig Blumberg, more moderate scholarship like Luke Timothy Johnson, for example. Uh, then as you go down the line, you have people like Rich. Michael Golder and Pervo, and I'm sure you have people you can recommend. I can recommend, but yeah, I
mhm.
would just encourage people to. It's fascinating stuff. Definitely study it more.
I would definitely agree with that, to look at both sides of the argument. And I feel like I've looked at both sides. I find myself more convinced of the, of the not reliable, I guess, arguments,
Mhm.
for Luke. So,
Mhm.
and I appreciate you having this conversation with me today. I really do. It's awesome getting you on here. Like I said, I've watched you on YouTube for a while, and so it's awesome to connect with you. And I doubt you remember me, but I did call into the call-in show that you do on Catholic
Oh
Answers.
yes, wow.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was a while ago or not. Yeah, it's
It
always
was
hard
I
for me
think
to
it was
keep
I
that.
think it was either 2 or 3 years ago that I called in. It's been a while. But
Sure, yeah,
we had a really good conversation then as well. But
good.
I yeah, I really appreciate you joining me to here today. If
Yeah,
you want to let everybody know again, remind them
yeah.
where they can find you and everything like that.
Yeah, and this is nice because we've got length on the radio show. I got 7 minutes, and then the next caller's got to go. So this has been nice, and then maybe we could talk about, maybe we could have a more focused discussion on mythicism. It's fascinating, but it's still tangential to today's topic. Still fascinating. Yeah, if people want to go and check out my work, they can go to my podcast at Council of Trent, COUNSEL. Council of Trent on YouTube, iTunes, Google Play. I have a number of books that have been published. The one most germane to today's discussion would be Hard Sayings, a Catholic approach to answering Bible difficulties. And so, if you want more on some of the biblical nature of things, check that out. If you want stuff, my writings on Jesus, I have a book called Counterfeit Christs. You want to check that out as well. But yeah, Council of Trent, COUNSEL, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube. So, and then definitely, if you're coming here to hear me and you haven't heard Godless Engineer before, definitely check out his channel. He's always having a fun time talking about things from the other perspective.
Yeah, I tried to at least. Thank you so much again, Trent, and everybody. Definitely go subscribe to his Council of Trent. He's got a number of good, videos on there where he discusses a lot of things. If you want to really engage in both sides of the debate, definitely go over there and check him out. And I guess I'll see you heathens later. We got a new video up tomorrow, and I guess we'll see you guys then. Don't forget to hold on. I gotta get my little thing up here. Okay. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.